welcome and thank you for coming. The organizers tonight want to begin by acknowledging that the organizers are on unceded Wolastoqey territory that's covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. What we ask is that you consider the colonial relations of power that work to structure access to this land and its resources. I think something that's especially relevant for our talk this evening. So thank you very much for coming out to our last Tertulia of our spring series, the Big Shakers edition. We're going to be back in 2 weeks on April 28th with our Tertulia Cities edition, beginning with a conversation with Leslie Kern about her text, Feminist Cities. The organizers for the event this evening are from St. Thomas University, Megan Hill, Tracy Glynn, Matthew Hayes, and me, Christy Elaine, and from UNB, Daniel Tubb. Our sponsors for the event are Between the Lines, Verso Press, Fernwood Press, Raven, the NB Media Co-op, and the Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network. So tonight we're pleased to welcome our speaker, Jason MacLean, and Jason is an assistant professor of law at UNB. Jason recently defended his dissertation entitled Essays on the Law and Politics of Canada's Climate Policy. Jason's research focuses on environmental law, natural resource law, climate change, energy, policy, sustainable pathways, and other fields. And we are very excited to have Jason with us tonight to speak about Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, and lessons from the youth climate activists. Thank you very much, Jason.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction, Christy. So I am just going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll see if that'll work. Yep. Okay, so I'll try to keep this presentation relatively brief so we can focus on Q&A, which is always the best part of Tertulias. And I really am glad to be here. When I moved to Fredericton last summer and I heard about these Tertulias, I thought these are the coolest thing ever. And I lobbied incessantly to be able to get a spot. And finally, at the end of the series, here I am to talk about Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, and the lessons and really the limits of youth climate activism in the context of climate advocacy and climate policy more generally. So just by way of some brief background, and I don't expect you to read the notes that I've put up in my little presentation here, although there are quite a few law students here, so there will be a test at the end, so you may want to pay attention, but they're really more for my use. So the way all of this started in late August of 2018, a few weeks before an upcoming election in Sweden. Greta Thunberg at the time, 15, born, as she likes to say, at 375 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. We just peaked recently at 421, a new record, and 450 is on the way rather soon. And we will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. She began to sit outside the Swedish parliament in the lead up to that election in a demand and in a way of generating attention to Sweden's deficient climate policy. And keep in mind, this was almost 3 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement on December 12th, 2015, and Sweden's climate policy still wasn't compliant with the temperature targets contained in the Paris Agreement. First, she was alone, handing out factoid flyers to people walking by. And if you've seen any one of the many documentaries made about Greta, you'll see that she was accosted by a number of old people and a number of other very serious people telling her that she should be in school. She was soon joined by other Friday school strikers, and a movement grew, and relatively quickly, first throughout Europe and then globally. And it's kind of crystallized into Fridays for Futures, which is in 7,500 cities, has had over 14 million people join its manifestations. and has so far achieved 0 law reforms. Here's Greta most recently on the upcoming global summit in the US on Earth Day. She was quoted recently in the New Yorker as saying, the things they're going to present will not be nearly enough for what science is saying, will be in line with the Paris Agreement, so I'll just be calling that out, I guess. And I chose that quote, and what she's talking about is a summit that's been convened by US President Biden. He's invited 40 world leaders, and they're going to talk about more ambitious action on climate change and other global matters. And although she doesn't have an advanced copy of the speeches, she is probably right that the goals that will be announced during this summit will not be Paris compliant. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So maybe just one lawyerly caveat at the outset. I'm not going to cover in the 25 or 30 minutes that I'm going to talk this evening the whole of youth climate activism, which has really become a varied and differentiated global movement. I'm focusing more on Greta herself and her messages and Fridays for Future, because I think that Greta and Fridays for Future really represent what I guess could be called the mainstream of youth climate activism. But there are other varieties of youth climate activism, including Indigenous youth climate activism, that are far more progressive than what I'm going to present here. And that can be something maybe we can talk about toward the end. So what are Greta's and Friday for Future's demands? Well, they argue that countries should comply with the Paris Agreement and aim for its more ambitious target of maintaining global warming above the pre-industrial norm to 1.5 degrees Celsius, along at the same time ensuring climate justice and equity. A really key message that they repeat is the idea of uniting behind the best unified science available. What they really mean by that are the reports published by or commissioned by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And the real touchstone report for this movement, really, it came out just a few months after Greta began her Friday climate strikes. And that is the IPCC's landmark report on the science and policy implications of 1.5 degrees global warming, released in October of 2018. She also, and Fridays for Future, also draw significantly on what's called the Planetary Boundaries Framework, as well as the potential of cascading irreversible tipping points across several global biomes, including the Arctic, and the focus there is on melting permafrost, and the Amazon rainforest, and the potential of the rainforest to transform into more of a savanna ecosystem and turn from being a carbon sink to a carbon source. They argue for the divestment from fossil fuels and the immediate ceasing of investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure. They call for legally binding annual national carbon budgets via the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities principle of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a just transition for workers and the most vulnerable populations. Just so you know, the global budget associated with a 66% likelihood of maintaining global warming above the pre-industrial norm to 1.5 degrees Celsius is 420 gigatons. We're emitting globally right now about 36 or 37 gigatons a year. So you can do the relatively simple math and realize that on business as usual trajectories, we don't have much time left before we exceed that particular budget. Helpfully, in my view, Greta and the Fridays for Futures call for no safety nets. And by nets, I mean negative emissions technologies. The most familiar one would be carbon capture and sequestration. But they also mean bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration and direct carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. In other words, technological solutions that don't involve system change. They also argue quite forcefully for what they call creative carbon accounting, which really takes two forms. One is the idea that we can continue to measure emissions in a territorial way. So for example, and I'll talk about this shortly tonight, the UK and Sweden are both self-styled climate progressive countries, but a large part of their climate progressive profile has to do with direct and upstream emissions reductions within their territories that do not account for emissions embedded in products that are imported into their countries and made elsewhere in different jurisdictions that under this framework would bear the responsibility of those particular carbon emissions. They also argue against the reliance upon carbon offsets, and that's an argument that I would amplify as well. I won't spend any time other than mentioning that they argue for the recognition, not literally ecocide at the International Criminal Court, that wouldn't be good, but the recognition of ecocide as a crime in international criminal law, along with advocacy for rights-based climate litigation throughout the world. Probably the most famous and overhyped of those cases is the Urgenda decision from the Netherlands. Ongoing cases in Canada, presently at the appellate level, are the LaRose class action and the Anjou class action in Quebec. Now, if I just scroll down just a little bit, this is a key quote from one of Greta's earliest speeches, where she essentially says that she's not saying anything new, and that's mostly true. She's simply saying what scientists have repeated for decades. And then she segues to perhaps the one unique discursive trope of youth climate activism, which is the youth element. And she says, I agree with you, and by you, she's referencing old people like most of us on this talk tonight, although not all of us, and world leaders in particular, saying we children shouldn't have to do this. And then she says, rather astonishingly, but since almost no one is doing anything and our very future is at risk, we feel like we have to continue. So that, in a nutshell, is Greta's message, which I'll unpack a little bit in terms of the limits that I see. Okay, I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. So I think there's what I've given you here, by the way, just so you can have something pretty to look at while I talk. This is a very sort of blown up version of the Keeling curve, measuring the atmospheric concentration in parts per million of carbon dioxide over the last month or so, showing that we've hit a new record. And then if I scroll down a little bit below, you can see the more traditional version of the Keeling curve, which shows the trajectory of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere from 1980 through to 2020. As you can see, it's going up, and it's going up quite quickly, not in a linear manner. And this is important for a couple of reasons. The first is a limitation, although by no means the strongest limitation of youth climate activism, is a relatively narrow framing of the problem to be solved, i.e. climate change, and specifically with a focus on reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, along with the framing of this challenge as being intergenerational or a future matter, by which youth climate activists emphasize wrongly, I think, over and over again, that this is something that climate change, that future generations will bear the brunt and the worst impacts. And while that's no doubt true, it tends to obfuscate the fact that, as we can see from these data, climate change is very much a matter of our contemporaneous reality, having quite devastating, disruptive impacts right now. And the crisis isn't simply a climate change crisis, as bad as that is, but it's really better considered as a socio-ecological crisis. And just one example that I thought I'd focus on, that I think everybody is familiar with, is COVID-19. And although the media rarely unpacks the connections between drivers of climate change and COVID-19, the scientific literature has. So we have very strong findings that show that deforestation and ecosystem homogenization, or the flip side of that coin, increasing biodiversity, and the effacing of the interface between human animals and non-human animals tends to increase something called zoonotic spillover. And zoonotic spillover refers to the transfer of diseases, viruses, from animals to human animals, so non-human animals to human animals, and is the source of COVID-19. So a broader focus on the socio-ecological crisis I face, I think, would be an improvement over youth climate activism's almost singular focus on climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second limitation that strikes me when you do a deep dive into youth climate activism and their discourse is that they strategically, so I do think they do this on purpose, but I do think it's misguided. They conflate the ought and the is. In one of Greta's more powerful speeches given at the Conference of the Parties in Katowice, Poland in 2018, she said, "We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You've ignored us in the past and you'll ignore us again. You've run out of excuses and we are running out of time. We've come here to let you know that change is coming whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people." And as loath as I am to be cynical, that's a ridiculous view. But it's a view that I think stems from trying to accomplish two things at once and potentially negating each other. One is an attempt to try and shame world leaders for their inaction on climate over the past 3 decades. And as part of that, to shame the quote unquote older generations who are stealing the future of youth. But on the other hand, there is this effort, which is not uncommon in social movements, to try and galvanize and expand their base by signaling to them that they do have power and that their movement will be successful. So while I do think that there is something of a theory of political change underlying this messaging, I think it's probably self-negating. The last limitation, and to my view, the most significant one, is the approach of youth climate activism to amplify and unite behind what they call the best unified science. In other words, the science that's achieved the greatest level of consensus, which again is usually captured by IPCC reports, interim reports, and the larger working group reports. And I think that there's two errors with respect to this. One is that it's, I think, unintentionally conservative and it ignores the precautionary principle of international environmental law. And secondly, it uncritically imagines climate policy in scientific technocratic terms. So let me just unpack both of those relatively quickly. I've adapted and reproduced a little table here from one of my favorite articles, which I joked with the organizers that I was tempted to just read from start to finish, because I think it is one of the most important articles currently in publication about climate change. And what the authors do is they look at Sweden and the UK, and of course a number of other countries, but they focus on these two countries because they're self-styled climate progressive nations, and compare their business as usual contributions to the global carbon budget, which I introduced earlier in the talk, what their Paris compliant budgets would be, their current business as usual mitigation rates, and then what their mitigation rates, i.e. the annual amount by which they're reducing their territorial greenhouse gas emissions, would be if they were Paris compliant. And by Paris compliant, these statistics are actually even more conservative than they could have been, because they're associated with the upper well below 2-degree target as opposed to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And the most important row is the bottom one, which shows that for the United Kingdom, their Paris compliant mitigation rate would have to be greater than 10% per year. So you can see just about a factor of 2 greater compared to what its business as usual rate is. And the increase in mitigation ambition for Sweden would be even over double. And I focus on this because although the IPCC reports generate a lot of attention, they focus attention, they have legitimacy insofar as, for example, the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming in 2018 was compiled by, I think it was about 148 authors reviewing over 6,000 peer-reviewed publications. Yet the reliance on the IPCC overlooks the otherwise well-known fact about their reports that they are political compromises and not simply scientific policy prescriptions. The application of a precautionary approach would call for setting far more ambitious targets and relying on climate science that's still, very robust and peer-reviewed, but is potentially presenting a more truthful and stark view of the scale of the problem. So that's the first science-based limitation. The second has to do with the planetary boundaries framework, which I think is fascinating and everybody should know about. And I don't expect you to read all that italicized text, but you can look at this little diagram that I've reproduced. And I think the most helpful way to look at this is to look at climate change, one of the boundaries identified, and the way in which this is one of the few truly interdisciplinary products of climate science and climate policy research. So what the authors have done is they've created, where data allows and it doesn't, in every case for every boundary identified, it identifies a safe zone, meaning a measure for the particular boundary under which we're safe, and then a zone of uncertainty, and then a zone beyond which we're in an area where we really don't know what's going to happen. So very dangerous area. And for climate change, that's very helpfully defined in the atmospheric concentration in parts per million of carbon dioxide, what I've already been identifying. So to put that in context, we have estimates that in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the global concentration of carbon dioxide was about 280 parts per million. We're now flirting with 421. The authors, using the precautionary principle of environmental law, have defined 350 parts per million or under as being the upper limit for a safe operating space in terms of climate change. It represents the stable climatic conditions of the Holocene as opposed to the Anthropocene, which we're now in. The upper boundary of the range of uncertainty is 450 parts per million. We are now, and this is the peak time of year for concentration of carbon dioxide, so we'll likely settle in for the year at a slightly lower concentration than 421, but we just reached 421.36, a new record. We'll probably settle in around 418 or 419 for the year, but nevertheless, you can see the quite steady and nonlinear growth, meaning that, and in contradistinction to the kind of far off future framing that youth climate activists sometimes fall into, Greta is fond of talking about what life will be like when she's 70. All of us on this call tonight are likely to live through 450 parts per million of global CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And that could bring impacts that are beyond what our models presently can account for. So that should be quite scary. And it means that we have to call for far more radical, far more ambitious climate policy making. Now, the interesting thing, and I realize that I'm going to try and sort of sum up, the interesting thing to note about the planetary boundaries framework and climate science as a whole is it isn't prescriptive with respect to climate science. So as critically important as it is to ground truth climate and sustainability policy proposals in the best available, and I would say the most precautionary climate science that's available, and not the more conservative estimates of the IPCC and a number of climate scientists who are essentially, whether they would style themselves this way or not, amateur psychologists or amateur therapists trying to massage the messaging and massage the estimates of climate models so as to not seem so stark, so as to paralyze the population. In his new book, which is relatively good, although falls into a number of these traps, Michael Mann, it's called The New Climate War, and he talks about the new discourses around climate change that have replaced climate denial. And one of them is doomism. And so Michael Mann has been pretty outspoken in attacking climate scientists like Kevin Anderson and his colleagues who have produced those much more stark estimates and much more ambitious estimates about what the mitigation rates should be for developed countries in the world as being doomist. And I think that it's a very potentially harmful tactic. And in fact, I think my best, or maybe not my best, but my most clever source for this is Greta herself. So Greta's story is a really interesting one. And of course, we wouldn't know anything about Greta's story, I think it really has to be added, if it weren't for Greta's remarkable parents, who in response to Greta's depression, upon not so much learning about climate change in school, but learning about climate change in school and then confronting the fact that it seemed like very few people, including her parents, including political leaders, but also including most of her peers, weren't saying anything about it, weren't talking about it, weren't reading about it, weren't thinking about it at all. And it was that sort of the disconnect in her mind between the scientific establishment of an existential crisis on the one hand, and then life kind of going on as usual on the other hand, that really led her at a very young age into a pretty profound depression. and a number of years where, she was really, she didn't eat enough, she didn't speak to anyone. And it was through becoming a climate activist that she began to overcome her depression and find her voice and find meaning in her life again. And I think her story is really interesting. But her story, again, is really dependent upon, I think, her remarkable parents. Her mother was, at one point, a world famous opera singer, and her father, I think world famous would be a stretch, but sort of if Sweden had like a B-level list of TV and movie actors, then he'd be one of those. And they essentially, lived a classic upper middle class bourgeois lifestyle until finally, in listening to their daughter, they not only changed their lifestyle, but dedicated much of their life to helping her become this new spokesperson, this new global spokesperson for this movement. And what I'm getting at with that anecdote is that there is a tendency in a lot of academic climate science and academic climate policy literature to try to play down the severity of the challenge that the world faces. And I think that Greta's own story is the best argument for not doing that and for not making presumptive diagnoses about how the public and policymakers will react to data and models in advance, and rather just present the best and most robust research as possible. All right, so let me just briefly sum up. So here are, to conclude, what I think are some likely very unpopular conclusions. And forgive me for pulling out this old saw, but I think it does work in this context. What's youthful about youth climate activism isn't especially new, or for that matter, youthful. Climate science and calls for more ambitious science-based policy are, old. They've been around for decades. What's new and youthful about youth climate activism, by contrast, isn't especially useful, and it may actually be counterproductive. And so there is a definite ageist messaging that is, in my view, in terms of trying to create a broad-based popular movement to put pressure on political leaders to adopt more ambitious climate policies, I don't think it's particularly helpful, and I also think it's empirically misplaced to draw upon discourses and tropes of shame that are aimed at older people. And I think the flip side of that is, I've been thinking through that, and of course it's important to point out that it's not consistent either. There are the few elect and chosen climate scientists, like Michael Mann, for example, but not Kevin Anderson, despite being the same age, and climate organizers like Bill McKibben, the climate author and advocate who formed the advocacy group 350.org, based on the scientific delineation of 350 million parts per million concentration of carbon dioxide as being the upper bound for a safe, stable climate, of course, have played a huge role in supporting the emergence of Greta and Fridays for Future and other youth climate activists like the Sunrise Movement in the United States, which I haven't spoken about tonight. But I would say that on the flip side, the presumptive we of youth climate activism, of the youthful we, is exaggerated. And it is nowhere near as large as the rhetoric and the discourse represents. And of course, I think part of that is strategic. It's a way of trying to present the movement as one is larger, being larger and more universal than it really is in order to attract more supporters. But I think both of these moves, in terms of directing shame and really quite a bit of anger, if you've seen some of Greta's speeches featuring the "how dare you" trope that you have with your fairy tales of continuous economic growth, have stolen our future and have stolen our hopes and dreams. The trope of shaming the old and overestimating the subscription of the youthful, I think both get in the way of the one thing that youth climate activism could otherwise add to climate policy making, which is forming a more popular and broad-based movement. I guess on a final note, I would say that one further problem with uniting behind the unified science, besides being unintentionally conservative and risky, I think it also further marginalizes Indigenous socio-ecological knowledge, which is problematic in at least two ways. So even if you're not concerned with the ethical imperative of decolonization, from a very pragmatic ecological stewardship perspective, the very solid finding that globally on lands managed or owned or both by Indigenous peoples, biodiversity loss is occurring, but it's occurring at a much slower rate than it is otherwise. So in many ways, the unintentional reliance on a technocratic imagination of what climate policy is and should be as following from climate science, embodied in the message, just listen to the science, misses again the opportunity to draw upon an incredibly rich source of time-tested knowledge about harmonious socio-ecological principles, aside or in addition to what I think is or should be the obvious moral imperative of working toward decolonization. Okay, I think I've already gone way longer than I intended to, so I think I'll leave it there and try and exit out of this. And hopefully there will be some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. So we do have one question, but like was said earlier, if you have questions, you can send them, you can post them in the chat room. So there's a question from Constantine. So he's trying to find, so Constantine wants me to voice a question. So a friendly question for Jason, and thank you for your outstanding presentation on a very difficult and complex issue. Specifically, my question is, who, in your opinion, is the real culprit standing between us and an environmental course correction? Is it consumers and consumption patterns, or is it business and their production methods and their choices in investment?
Thanks for the question, Constantine. And just before I answer, I just want to say hello to my good and old friend, Paul Berger at Lakehead. It's great to see you, man. Paul was a colleague of mine at Lakehead University when I started my academic career, and did an enormous amount for me in terms of helping me along the way in my research and my advocacy. So it's really great to see you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the question, Constantine. So the theme in the focus of my own research on climate sustainability policy making focuses on, it's not exactly a household word, but regulatory capture. So the ways in which special concentrated interests have captured public policy making to divert what should be public interest legislation and regulation and governance mechanisms toward their own private interests. So I would see it as a kind of a complex and perverted relationship among those industries that are the most carbon intensive, and their willing conspirators in our governments are largely responsible. I think it's misplaced, and by and large, Greta does a good job of this, and Fridays for Future does a good job of this. And I feel like I've been too hard on them, but they do a good job of trying to shift attention away from individual consumer choices as being the focus of climate action, although they do nevertheless fall into it at times. And even the whole saga about Greta, sailing from the UK to New York to attend UN climate talks on a carbon-friendly and carbon fiber boat, and I think the journey took—I can't remember how long it took, it's like 2 months, as a means of avoiding flying. Although I think it was largely motivated by de-weaponizing her critics, who would have, in a really lazy and predictable way, pointed to hypocrisy in the way that people used to, for example, criticize Al Gore by pointing out his carbon footprint or the size of his home. But nevertheless, I think that the disproportionate amount of attention that was paid to the difficulty of that journey and of avoiding flying still ended up putting more attention on individual actions. But consumers, by and large, and not just consumers, but people, by and large, make the choices that they make within systems that are always already constrained. And so to focus on addressing climate change through individual actions is to just buy into a neoliberal corporate rhetoric. And it's really interesting, but the whole idea of let's begin measuring our carbon footprint was an idea really championed and pushed by British Petroleum, who's been really, I think, brilliantly trolled on social media. So when British Petroleum tweets, its new app for measuring carbon footprint, climate activists, many youthful, many not so youthful, have responded by saying, "What's yours?" Essentially, what's your carbon footprint? And even then, the focus needs to shift in terms of the way in which these concentrated and powerful industries are shaping what our government policies are. And even the project that I'm working on at the moment, not even just specific policies and not even just influence over government regulations in the very familiar quid pro quo manner. For example, the inquiry that looks like is about to be launched in the UK with respect to David Cameron's really quite brazen and obvious quid pro quo lobbying once he left government for a financial firm, but rather the way in which otherwise regulated entities manage to shape and capture the imagination of what's possible in terms of regulation. And I haven't had a chance to say it yet, but now I'm going to say it. If you're looking for an example of this in Canada, you can look no further than the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, known to everyone, of course, as the Guga Papa. And it basically sets forth a very limited series of market-based mechanisms, replete with exemptions in the fine print that very few people ever read, as the primary, almost exclusive way of addressing climate change in Canada. And so it's a very impoverished view, but it's one that very much suits industry interests. I hope that answers your question, Constantine.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Matthew, and then we'll go to Paul.
Hi, Jason. I'm so glad that the Guga Papa finally got a mention. That was awesome. But there was another kind of idea that I thought you skirted a little bit, which is capitalism So in the terms of the narrow focus is that this is just a greenhouse gas emissions problem and not an ecological emergency, a broader ecological emergency, but it's an ecological emergency whose cause is in the class interests of capitalist class. So I was just wondering if you had anything more to say about particularly class and how class plays out in this crisis, and indeed, also how it doesn't. We never hear about class as being, or even a climate change as being a class issue, even though the effects of it will be felt by global social classes who cannot afford basically to protect themselves from climate change. And of course, there are other social classes who will use various forms of mobility to escape climate change and whatnot. So I'm wondering if you could address that, and if I can, like the other thing that I just wanted to bring up was with respect to whether or not the public really cares about the data. So I wanted to push you a bit on this idea that that Greta is somehow being contradictory. I actually think that despite the ageism in the Fridays for Future movement, which I agree with and should be addressed, I think can be addressed just by having these types of conversations. But she has made this a kind of dramatic encounter that in the political sphere I think is very useful. And I was just wondering if you had anything more to say about that.
Sure. Well, thanks for not posing a really large, massive, and complicated question. I should be able to deal with the relationship between our socio-ecological moment and capitalism. But I actually do have a way. I think I can address the first part of your question. Something I left out of the talk because I was wondering, and I meant to say at the beginning that I was going to try and not make it very technical. And then I decided that I wouldn't do that because I think part of the point is that our discourse isn't nearly technical enough. So I'll come back to that because that relates to your second question. But for your first question, I was wondering if anybody was going to kind of push back on, my reliance on Kevin Anderson's work in terms of, developed countries having to double the level of their ambition. And I was going to, there's other work that draws upon the distinction between relative decarbonization and absolute decarbonization, or the difference, put more plainly, between efficiency measures on the one hand and just absolute levels of emissions on the other. And those numbers are even more stark than the emissions reduction numbers with respect to the global carbon budget associated with just a 2/3 chance of peaking at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what those numbers suggest is that developed countries need to achieve decarbonization at a rate of something like 14% a year for the next 3 decades. Right now, the average mitigation rate globally is 1%. The last time that we had a number as high as 3% was following the oil crises in the 1970s. So there's a clear class component to this in the sense that, as in my answer to Constantine, on focusing on, and I think in many ways, the Paris Agreement is very much an agreement that seeks to accommodate the productive or the extractive class, or both, however you want to frame it, in the sense that it, along with the Sustainable Development Goals, appears to contemplate and imagine as complementary ongoing economic growth, climate change mitigation, and Earth system stabilization and sustainability all at once. or as some people like to put it, we can achieve quote unquote green growth. There just isn't any evidence yet that we can do that, nor are there really models that show that. It's rather more of a presumption to which increasingly nagging doubts are being added, such that we need to begin to talk about redistribution as opposed to just constant growth. So an interesting offshoot, I think, of Marxism is developing and beginning to find its feet in terms of the degrowth scholarly movement, which I think has been around for a while now, for at least a decade or a decade and a half. But there's more and more work coming out in that regard. And I do think, though, that the flip side of that is being addressed, and isn't it, at least it's name checked by Greta and Fridays for Futures, even though it doesn't always really seem front and center, and that is the focus on climate justice and equity focuses on both within countries and between countries. The idea that climate policy should not just aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, although that is the primary focus, but it should do so in a way that affects just transition for the most vulnerable populations. And so climate justice in that sense is an extension of the work that's been going on for a couple decades around environmental racism, the way marginalized groups tend to actually live and work in areas closest to environmental pollution and then suffer the consequences of that. The climate justice literature is an extension of that. So I think in many ways, that's a really interesting tension, but I'm not sure that it's really front of mind for youth climate activists, at least those in the global north. I think it's absolutely front of mind for the youth climate activists who are emerging in the global south. And so that'll be interesting to watch how those discourses intersect, especially at the upcoming, if it occurs, the upcoming Conference of the Parties, which is scheduled to go ahead in Glasgow in November. And, you know, it's the next last chance that the globe has to write its emissions trajectory before 2030. You know, as Paul will know, Paul and I went to the climate march in New York City in 2014, along with 400,000 other really sweaty people in a tiny part of Manhattan on that afternoon. And that at the time was billed, the UN meetings coming up and the COP in Lima a few months later was billed as the last chance to get the world on track. It seems like we give ourselves infinite last chances to do these things. So I predict that eventually there will be a cleavage that will emerge in the climate justice literature between the global north and the global south, because trying to figure out an equitable way, and this is another thing that I didn't have time to talk about, but to find an equitable and politically legitimate way to come up with equitable carbon budgets is going to be an enormous geopolitical battle if and when we get there, and simply can't be dictated by climate models or climate science alone. And even some of the more progressive approaches to climate modeling will kind of sneak into the back door of their analysis the idea, well, the global south is still going to have to take it on the chin. It can't possibly develop in terms of like the same trajectories that the global north went through, because the math just won't allow it. With respect to whether or not, your second question, Matthew, whether or not the public care, well, I don't know, but I don't know that we can possibly know. When I read Canadian concentrated corporate media on climate policy, it's written in such a way as if climate science and data don't exist. So for those of you who follow this really closely, you'll know that the government in Canada, the federal government, is on a 1 to 2 year lag in its reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it just recently reported national emissions for the year 2019. And in 2019, we came in at 730 million tons of carbon dioxide. So to put that in perspective, in the baseline year of 2005 that we chose as the baseline year for our NDC under the Paris Agreement, we emitted 731 million tons. So on the one hand, good news, right? We're down. The problem is that our very unambitious target under the Paris Agreement was to reduce our emissions from the baseline year by 30% by the year 2005. And so we're not even remotely on track to doing that. And yet there's so much both climate policy illiteracy, innumeracy, and just ignorance in Canada, including the Canadian media, that the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change is able to spin this as we're on track. And he even said it was good news because it could have been much worse. So I guess my response to you, Matthew, is I would love it if we could run a natural experiment to see if the public would care, because right now, in most of the discourse that the public gets when it's not otherwise looking for information, contains absolutely no data whatsoever, no mention of scientific models, nothing. And we essentially have a lapdog media in Canada when it comes to climate policy. And so it's not a surprise that climate policy never really figures prominently in our political discussions, because Canadians, by and large, and the polling data bear this out very clearly, a majority of Canadians across every region of Canada believe that Canada can be, and already is, a climate policy leader on the global scale and can continue to do so while increasing oil sands production in Saskatchewan and Alberta. There's, of course, no evidence to suggest that's true, and a mountain of evidence to suggest that it's contradictory, but most Canadians don't know that. They're not aware of it.
Thanks. I think Paul Berger is going to voice his question.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Jason. It is delightful to see and hear you again. That's so kind of awesome. I think this question follows pretty well from your last answer. I've been reading one of Greta's country folk, Andreas Malm, who is basically questioning why the climate movement, which is about the whole fate of the Earth, is one of the only mass social movements in history that seems to be scrupulously polite and incredibly nonviolent, and doesn't have a flank or a wing. It's not true that there isn't anyone, but it seems to stop. It'll politely go in and stop a coal mine's work for the day, or block a tanker somewhere, but doesn't do any kind of sabotage or anything that would scare anyone. And given what you said, given the lack of movement, he's sort of saying, like, now we've had this youth climate movement, we've had this huge upsurge in awareness. I think for me, as a climate activist, the discourse is totally different than it was 2 years ago in many ways. But he says, the forces against change are so strong. What if 5 years from now we still haven't started bending that curve down? Like, when are we going to have a violent flank to this movement? So my question to you really is, do you think that there's any chance of moving the powerful without there being some cost to them, without there being some sort of a flank? Not the Gretas, not the Bill McKibbins. They have their role of, they don't want to alienate people. But when are we going to have a little violent faction that's doing property damage? I'm not suggesting they're hurting anybody. Or is that never going to develop? Or are we going to give the world away without that ever developing?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And like I said, really great to see you. Matthew and I have both been reading Andreas Malm, and I've got on my bookshelf his latest book. And for those of you who don't know, it has the very winning title of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, just to make sure it doesn't leave any doubt about what the focus of the book is. And is posing this idea that we're in a situation globally where the numbers are so stark. Forgive me, Matthew, for going back to the numbers. I know you don't care about them, but I'm just kidding. But the numbers are so stark that even if we were to allow all of the coal-fired power infrastructure that's already in place, let alone more coal-fired power infrastructure that's being commissioned and built, but the coal-fired power infrastructure that's already in place, if we, I mean, the Royal Global, we, the Tertulia, if we allow this this infrastructure to essentially be utilized over its life course of 25 to 35 years, depending on what it is and where it is, that in and of itself alone will consume the remaining global carbon budget associated with a 66% chance, not a 90% chance, a 66% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial norm. So, you know, building on those ideas, you know, Malm is really making the point that we need to begin to destroy the infrastructure if our policies won't do it. And I think that this, you know, I think we've already seen the beginnings of this use of quote unquote violence toward property, both in Canada and throughout the world. Indigenous peoples in particular have been for decades putting their bodies on the line to stop ecological destruction through a variety of different kinds of infrastructure projects. That's ongoing in Canada, in different parts of Canada. It's ongoing in the United States. But I guess my worry about it is that while you're right, and while I agree with you that the discourse is different now than it was 2 years ago, policymaking isn't, though. Policymaking hasn't budged one bit. And I know that, you know, that was the premise of your question and your reference to Malm. But my own fear, I guess, is twofold. That one, infrastructure destruction will be viewed by a great many people otherwise nominally concerned with climate change, if not yet prepared to actually do anything about it. They'll view that as beyond the pale, right? And secondly, we're already beginning to see the emergence of a legal response, even preemptively, to that. So the first bill, Bill 1 of the Alberta provincial government of Jason Kenney, was the critical infrastructure bill, which criminalized even being near oil pipeline projects and imposes really quite severe fines. And I think coupled with that legal response and the use of criminal law, I really worry about the buildup of increasingly militarized police and the confrontation that may emerge. So I don't know. It's a very uncomfortable question. It's probably in part why you posed it, as you know, because my day job is in a law faculty outside of the business school, by far and away the most conservative element of any university. And so the idea, I have to be very careful, because the idea, if I'm promoting property damage, you know, there's going to be letters to the dean, and you know, I'm going to have to spend a whole day dealing with all this. But a friend and colleague of mine, Hugo Tremblay at the University of Montreal, wrote a really interesting piece about this a number of years ago, really ahead of the curve, trying to articulate the application and extension of the criminal defense of necessity for those that would take these. And I think we talked about that article, Paul, a number of years ago. So I think that I'll just say, without recommending, just making an observation, an Archimedean observation from on high without any endorsement, that if we continue to go year after year with, as Greta would nicely put it, very fine speeches and lofty declarations, but essentially meaningless, net zero 2050 pledges, we'll absolutely see more violence. But I'm really fearful of the violent response, both through the use of the criminal law and just the use of an increasingly militarized police force. And I think there's going to be a really awful inequity to that confrontation. But it seems inevitable, doesn't it? I mean, what are your thoughts? I'm really curious to know what you think about that.
Well, I don't think everybody else cares what I think, but I think your answer was right on in terms of that. I'm not advocating it either. I'm just also agreeing, and I have tears of frustration sometimes with a lot of the things you've been talking about. How little Canadians know about climate change, how little policy movement there is, how we can have politicians that buy pipelines and say it's in the national interest. My gut reaction is I want to blow something up. But if we start doing that and we lose the support that we have, clearly that would be incredibly counterproductive. And as you say, we're vastly outgunned. So, but I do think Malm's thesis is worth thinking about because of what history says about other movements, and at what time, when will we be moved to act because nothing else is working and has worked. Thanks for your answer. That was awesome.
No, just to quickly to add to that, I mean, another fear that I have about his argument, and I thought about this just reading his brief bio, Malm's brief bio, about how in the past, I think he admits to slashing the tires of SUVs. The drivers of SUVs in the UK and throughout Europe will just get new tires, and I'm afraid that infrastructure destruction, depending on its scale and its concentration, just creates another opportunity for more good Canadian jobs to rebuild the pipeline, because there's no better Canadian job, and we all know, than a temporary construction job building a pipeline. But yeah, I think you're right, Paul. Malm's thesis, because it's also just so outside the very sort of constrained, liberal, technocratic parameters of climate policy discourse, it deserves careful consideration just because of that alone. Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to go to Daniel and then a question from Carrie. So that's the order. Go, Daniel.
Thanks so much. Not to continue talking about blowing up pipelines, but in my day job, when I'm not co-organizing Tertulias, I work in Colombia, and the National Liberation Army there has been blowing up pipelines for 35 years, and they get rebuilt, and it hasn't been particularly good for anyone in Colombia. So maybe I don't support blowing up pipelines. But I guess my question for you, Jason, is the following, and maybe I'm preempting a conversation we might have next week. But it's sort of thinking about many of the folks on this call, not everyone by a long shot, but some of us are academics in New Brunswick at one of various universities. And so my question for you, you've talked a lot about policy capture, about lapdog media, about the importance of moving beyond technocratic policy solutions that aren't working. And my question is there a role for us as educators, as writers, as scholars to shift these kinds of conversations in the small part of the world that we all call home, which is New Brunswick Maritimes, where we have our own, large corporations doing lots of fun things with carbon. Is there a role for public academics in this part of the world, outside of Tertulias, of course?
Right. I definitely think so. Although I'm mindful of So I think there's a role, and I think there's an imperative to do it. If you're working on issues like climate change and sustainability and intersecting issues of decolonization as well, and just greater social equality and the complex intersection of these issues, then I think we have an obligation to reach out beyond the pages of the academic journal articles and books that people write. But I think that work is very important as well in terms of developing the ideas to make them as robust and as tested as possible. And I suppose it plays a role just more instrumentally in terms of political legitimacy. And so, yes, I do. And I'm constantly trying to think of better and more effective ways that I could do that kind of writing and outreach to achieve, greater mobilization and influence. So it's very difficult to track. And there are many people on this call or seminar tonight who do this kind of work and have been doing it for a long time and know more about it than I do. But I'm actually, in thinking about your question, Daniel, I'm also mindful of something that Matthew has said a lot in a number of our discussions, is that we also have to be careful when we set about talking about the role of academics, and also sometimes, I guess for convenience, we refer to the left or the progressive left, and we just don't seem to be really winning. I've been railing against the Gugu Papa for years now, and there's just sort of an echo chain. There's just really there's not a lot of impact. And Matthew will usefully remind us, or me anyway, in some of these discussions, that the forces that we're up against, especially in terms of highly concentrated corporate media, are pretty powerful and pretty influential. So part of my research now, or one of the projects that I'm embarking on, I've already done a little bit of work in this regard, and now I intend to do much more, is to begin to more systematically study the ways in which Canadian corporate media actively misrepresent climate science and climate policy, in part because I know from the journalists that I've been able to meet and cultivate relationships with that the media are very interested in themselves. And so one way in which to smuggle in more climate change into media discourse is to link it to the way in which the media deals with climate change. So that's something that I'm going to do some empirical projects on, and hopefully that can cross over into some greater media literacy outreach as well. But yes, I absolutely agree with you, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and chatting about these ideas more. I'm constantly trying to think about what would be the best way, what would be a better way of working in this regard. Paul and I used to talk about this all the time at Lakehead. How can we better engage and get more people involved and thinking about climate change and acting on climate change in our local communities. And I mean, to the point, the part of your question, which I also think is important, Daniel, like here in New Brunswick, I think here everywhere, right? I mean, global climate change is a global problem, but it requires contextually derived, contextually sensitive, contextually legitimate solutions and innovation and imagination from the ground up. The 30 plus years of high-level international diplomacy through the United Nations has been a spectacular, epic fail, right? And even though the Paris Agreement actually tries to incorporate into its architecture kind of bottom-up polycentric governance and decision-making, it hasn't really done so, and it hasn't yet succeeded. I mean, it may well yet still, and let's hope that it does, because at the moment, it's our best answer in terms of a global architecture It's the best one that we have. And yet 5 years in, it's not working. So I think the local matters greatly. And I also think, and if just to, the reason why I'm so, or maybe I'm kind of hard on Greta and the youth climate activists is because messaging and strategy really matters. And it's too simple and I think lazy and incorrect to say, oh, just whatever you're doing, it's great. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, as Chairman Mao used to say. I don't think that that's actually true when it comes to climate sustainability, because many of these discourses are at odds with one another, and a technocratic, market-based discourse, as embodied by something like the Gugu Papa, for example, is not, in my view, a promising approach. And the longer that we, and this kind of follows up, just I'll finish and get to Carrie's question, but to relate to Paul's question as well, the longer that we go without beginning to make the radical system-wide changes to our politics and our laws required to bend the emissions curve, the more likely that there might, sorry, Tom. So I use the Gugu Papa as an acronym for the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which I find very hard to say multiple times in a row, but I find that the Gugu Papa kind of, it's also my way of sort of putting it in its place. Anyway, the longer that we go without law and policy changes, the more likely we are to see maybe violence and escalation. But also, I think the more likely we are to see policymakers saying, okay, well, you know what? I hear you, Greta. I hear you, Fridays for Future. We have to listen to the science. And what the science is saying is that we have to adopt global engineering experiments. We have to move to solar radiation management and direct carbon dioxide capture from the air. And we have to begin scaling these things up. And of course, those approaches are very narrowly cast and really do nothing to address the broader, socio-ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. So that's what's really keeping me up at night, is that every year that we go without changing business as usual is another boost to the momentum toward these sort of techno-utopian solutions waiting in the wings that the atmospheric physicists say are no-brainers. Just shoot sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere and we'll be great. And we'll figure out how to, of course, emissions will continue to go up, but we'll cool the planet. And eventually we'll go over the peak, fine, but we'll be able to shave the peak by directly pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it somewhere, or maybe turning it into a kind of fuel for airlines like Air Canada, which is about to get a massive government bailout with no strings attached. Anyway, I digress. Carrie.
I think Carrie wanted me to voice her question, but okay. So don't you think using a living tree approach to the Constitution that we could find a right to a clean environment? I mean, the Charter presumably is prefaced on an environment that is capable of sustaining humans that possess rights.
This feels like a trick question coming from a constitutional originalist. So I've noted at the beginning of my little presentation that one branch, although not something that Greta herself, and this is one of the many things that I really admire about Greta, she's pretty skeptical as well of rights-based climate litigation, particularly following the Norway decision allowing ongoing and increased offshore oil and gas exploration back in November, which of course didn't stop Norway from co-chairing a panel on sustainable ocean management. And I've yet to hear how those two things can be squared. But I'm, and this is, uncomfortable given that I'm paid to be a law professor, but I'm a massive litigation skeptic, especially in respect of climate change. And we've gone through a number of different waves. And, at first the idea was a number of scholars sort of suggested, oh, well, let's just amend the Constitution to add a healthy right to the environment. Of course, we've never amended the Charter in Canada, as you well know. And if we had the political support required to amend the Charter, then we wouldn't have to, because that political support would already be translated into robust environmental laws. So that argument kind of fell by the wayside. And then the argument came, well, let's read into Section 7 of the Charter, the right to life. How does it go? Life, liberty, and security of the person, I think. Is that it? Okay, good. And so far, courts haven't taken up that argument. And the most recent rejection was the federal court in the LaRose youth climate case that was dismissed by the federal court back in the fall. And interestingly, and the youth are appealing, or the youth lawyers are appealing, and doing all the work and creating all the arguments. They're likely not going to appeal the trial court's finding that the Charter arguments were non-justiciable, which for non-lawyers means a question is non-justiciable. That means to a court in Canada that the question is too political in nature to be resolved by a court. And they're going to focus all of their energy on the appeal on the atmospheric trust argument. So we'll see how that goes. They will, without a doubt, lose at the Federal Court of Appeal, as environmentalists do. And then the question becomes whether or not they can get leave to the Supreme Court of Canada, and no one knows. And then the next line of argument, I guess, Carrie, beyond the interpretation of the Charter, and this I'm going to, by saying this, I'm actually going to try and answer your question. The advocates for this argument have now and most recently shifted to the idea that the right to sustainable environment or ecological sustainability, exactly, should be recognized by the courts as an unwritten principle of constitutional law, like federalism and democracy and the rule of law and the respect for minorities. That argument was tried in the judicial reference to the British Columbia Court of Appeal with respect to its pipeline regulations, which were struck down, but not on those grounds. And the Supreme Court of Canada didn't take it up. I don't think that there's any likely success for either of these arguments, because they prove too much. So finding a right to a healthy environment, whether it's through a living tree purposive interpretation of the Charter or through recognizing an unwritten principle, it doesn't seem to me that there would be any way to circumscribe the parameters of that right. And given that in Canadian constitutional law, and you know this far better than I do, there isn't a hierarchy of rights, and yet the very framing of the unwritten principle, I mean, the way it goes, and this framing has been used in the United States as well in constitutional law scholarship, it's like it's the right of rights. You can't have a right to security of the person if you don't have a healthy, sustainable environment underneath. So whether or not there are good or strong legal arguments for this, I just don't believe. I'm in fact firmly convinced, based on the jurisprudence that's been derived through the constitutional challenges to the validity of the Gugu Papa, that Canadian courts would go that far, because essentially they would be, in doing so, really intervening in the recognition, either through the interpretation of Section 7 of the Charter or through an unwritten principle, would really be so incredibly intrusive and transformational. Hence, this is why we want to do it, or why advocates want to do it, of the political realm, of the public policy realm. And I think, as Mark Tushnet put it in the United States, the idea of doing it this way appears, this was his word, seedy, because it really is a way of working around politics, right? It's a recourse to the courts and to the Constitution because you can't get the result you want in the political process. And in my, maybe it's unfair, uncharitable view of most law scholars, they tend to look at every public policy problem through the lens of what's possible through appellate litigation. And I think that that just really misses the broader point that if you want a legitimate and ambitious climate change law, you'll have to generate that through bottom-up, broad popular support. So whatever the abstruse constitutional law arguments are, and I'm fairly familiar with them, to me that misses the entire point that these are, in fact, political questions and should be dealt with, in fact, in the political realm, and we'll end up getting what we deserve. But I think that courts in Canada are incredibly conservative, and they would fear risking and losing institutional legitimacy if they went that far. And I mean, just to look at the most recent, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in respect of the constitutional validity of the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act is so incredibly narrow, so as to not upset the apple cart of federalism and the division of powers. And the court was unmoved by my argument in a recent article where I posed the rhetorical question of what good is federalism if we're all dead? But for the Supreme Court of Canada, federalism matters a great deal indeed, far more than giving the federal government a very broad authority in respect of climate change regulation. Now, maybe you have a different view, but and I'd be interested to hear it. But for me, it's really largely a political question, independent of what the legal merits might be. I don't think the unwritten principles argument is strong at all. In terms of, there's an obvious intuitive appeal with respect to the Section 7 argument, I suppose, from a living tree purposive approach. I don't know how it would look from an originalist approach. I don't know what folks were thinking about in terms of climate change in the late 70s, early 80s. You might, but I don't. I suspect that they weren't thinking about it at all.
Yeah, you had some tree huggers in there.
But have a few, right? A few token environmentalists.
But it was more in terms of making sure that property was excluded from Section 7 so that you could have environmental regulations. So I think they were looking at it more like having a zone of, making sure that government could act, because back then it was seen as government, is going to be the one that saves us, right? So that was more it. But yeah, and I think it's an interesting question to the extent that politics is so divorced from the Constitution, but that will lead us down a different road entirely. And there's other questions. So
we're seemingly divorced, but not really divorced, as all of the opinions in respect of the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, that's all political discourse and not law.
Yeah, but I mean vice versa. The Constitution should inform the politics too. But
agreed, absolutely. Ella, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I just had a question in regards to just the environment and the law. So, obviously, if you look at any course outline, you see, with criminal law, there's multiple courses, a wide variety of area. But I feel like with environmental law, and I'm speaking for UNB law, we only have, 3 or 4 classes. Do you feel as though that law students who are tree huggers are getting enough environmental law, or do you think that we should rally and advocate for Indigenous law in regards to environmental racism and just just a more diverse area of law when it comes to the environment?
Thanks for the question, Ella. And I promise that was not a prompted place. I could see some of you smirking, thinking, oh, yeah, but I promise she asked that question independently. So, my view is pretty strong on this. I think that, so I'm working on a really short, informal essay, the title of which is, Should Youth Climate Activists Go to Law School? It depends, but generally I would say no, certainly not in Canada. So the curriculum is still remarkably similar to what it was over 100 years ago, with a few changes, some of which are significant. So in some law schools across the country have responded to the call of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report in 2015 to include a mandatory course on Aboriginal law that would cover, the history of reserves and residential schools and colonization, etc. Not all schools have done that. UNB Law hasn't yet done that. It may. So when I was at a different law school that had introduced such a course, the University of Saskatchewan's College of Law introduced a course called Quayas Kastasuan, which is, I'm told, Cree for setting things right, which is the closest analog that could be found to the idea of reconciliation. And I was having a pint with my dean, who was very proud, rightfully so, of the college having established this course. And I was saying, the idea that you would graduate lawyers, law students in 2020, without, not just that mandatory course, but without a proper grounding in Indigenous legal orders and decolonization, etc., is kind of unthinkable, right? Like, it's so anachronistic to do it in another way. What a great thing that we're doing this for first-year students. And I let that sort of sink in. I could see him smile, and he took a congratulatory sip of his beer. And I said, what other issue do you think that maybe in the year 2020 every student should get a grounding in? And he kind of looked warily at me, and he realized that I was working on him. And I said, don't you think like we should have a mandatory course on the law, policy, and governance dimensions of climate change and sustainability? I mean, it's kind of a big deal. And yet, as it is in most schools, environmental law and quote unquote natural resources law still compete with classes which I actually think are ethically indefensible, on oil and gas leasing at Canadian law schools, and mining law with a focus on prospecting and leasing, i.e., mining, as opposed to the sustainability or law and policy issues around it. But law schools, and there's at least one other law professor here tonight, so but law schools, like the common law, are conservative in a small c way, and incremental, and suffer from incredible inertia by design. And so that is a limiting feature that's built in. But I guess to answer your question, Ella, I think that law students should advocate strongly for their curriculum to reflect the world that they're going out into, and not reflect the unreconstructed legal positivism of categories of law invented at Harvard in the 1800s and barely adapted, over 150 years later, and unthinkingly and uncritically. I would definitely argue for that. And some schools are engaging in some innovative curricular reform, and hopefully we'll see more of that, because it takes a few schools, I think, to nudge the others to, like, oh, we better make some changes, or we'll fall behind in the marketplace and competition for the very best students. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think you should advocate. And I think that schools will listen to students as well if you can mobilize enough support and work with professors to inform your proposals and generate broad support amongst your colleagues. Absolutely.
Okay, are there any more questions for Jason? We are at 10 after 9, so
I would be happy to talk about these issues for many, many hours. But as the host, you may not want to do that.
Well, I want to thank you, Jason, for a great talk. I have some questions for you, but I'm going to save them for the next time I see you in person. And I just wanted to announce that the next Tertulia is with Leslie Kern, who is at Mount Allison University, and she's the author of Feminist City. That's on April 28th, Wednesday, April 28th at 7:30. So hopefully you can join us for that. It should be a good talk in the lead up to the municipal elections. So thank you, Jason, and everybody for coming tonight.